Good morning, everyone. My name is Filippo Baldi. I am a master's graduate in global management and international politics, and I'm here today with Sebastian Strangio, who is a journalist, author, and analyst specializing in the study of Southeast Asia. A graduate in international politics from the University of Melbourne, he immediately embarked on a career as a Southeast journalism correspondent, eventually writing for prestigious Asian and Western newspapers such as the New York Times, Al Jazeera, and The Economist. In 2014, he published his first book, uh, published by Yale University Press, called Hun Sen's Cambodia. And building on its success in 2020, he wrote a dragon in the Dragon's Shadow, Southeast Asia in the Chinese Century. And following the success of the book in 2022, it was published in Italian by Ad Editori with the title All'ombra del Dragone, il Sudest asiatico nel secolo cinese. So this book guides us through the complex region that is the South Asia in light of its recent relevant economic and geopolitical situation and importance. I found very interesting the fact that the book dedicated a chapter to all of the main players in the region. Sebastian, what motivated you to pursue writing this book in this way? And do you find that there is any particular country that was fascinating and interesting to highlight and to study?
Well, I mean, when I embarked on when I first came up with the idea for this book, I was, I witnessed for myself the massive changes that were being wrought by Chinese investment, political influence, flows of expatriates and business people into Cambodia, where I was based at the time. Everywhere in the country you went, you saw signs of this transformation. And I came up with the idea of following this regionally. I'd done a lot of reporting on the subject over the years, and I thought it would make for a topic for a really good book. The decision to divide the book up by nation came relatively late in the process. My initial thought was to, divide the book up into thematic chapters. Chapters on, investment and infrastructure. Chapter on the overseas Chinese and their relationship with China. But the more that I got into it, the more I realized that the particular national trajectories of each of these countries were so specific, and the particular relationship that China had with these nation states and their precursors was so specific that there was no. I would have ended up spending a lot of time going down rabbit holes to explain national differences. And so, in the end, I decided I would make each chapter sort of a self-contained, I guess, extended feature article about a particular nation, and each of them sort of builds on the last. So that was, and I was able to, I was unable to, unfortunately, include Timor-Leste and Brunei. Part of the reason for that is that I wanted to make sure that I traveled to every country that I examined, and the fact that I wasn't able to get to these places, I felt that to include them in a perfunctory manner, as a couple of footnotes or a page here or a page there, wouldn't have done them justice. And I actually think that the argument I make in the book about the diversity of Southeast Asia and the diversity of responses to the rise of Chinese power is amply demonstrated by the 9 case studies that I included in the book. There would have been it wouldn't have added much more analytically to my book to include these other 2 countries, even though I'm very disappointed that I wasn't able to.
Perfect. So I have a lightning question. So did the past colonial experiences that the countries in Southeast Asia that they had in the 20th century, in what way did they impact how they deal with Chinese both political and economic expansion in the region?
Well, it's
Do
an
you believe?
interesting question. I mean, one of the main overlapping, I suppose, experiences that the nations of Southeast Asia share with modern China is this experience of bruising encounters with imperial power. Mostly European power, but of course we also had the United States colonizing the Philippines, and a number of the Imperial Japan also conquering large parts of the region during the Second World War. And China was not formally conquered, but it was subjugated to a large extent by the European colonial powers. And Chinese nationalism arises to some extent in relationship with that challenge. A very similar story with regional and national variations plays out within Southeast Asia. This sort of attempt by intellectuals in all of these countries to meet the challenge posed by the Western empires, and that involved reassessing traditional forms and traditional ideas, the adoption of ideas from the West, such as Marxism, Leninism, and other forms of other ideas to drive these anti-colonial movements. And it's left, I think, the main legacy of this is that Southeast Asian nations remain very jealous of their sovereignty. They remain incredibly nationalistic. Both of these things are also true of China. And so what you see a certain dynamic when China, asserts these principles on the global stage. It tends to find quite a lot of support from Southeast Asian governments. Conversely, when Western powers criticize Southeast Asian nations on questions of human rights or democratic backsliding, it very often elicits a sort of anti-colonial reflex. A sort of hostility to what they perceive to be, being talked down to or to be condescended to by Western powers. And very often they turn to China for sort of, in the extreme cases to make up for, the Western government's unwillingness to engage because of these issues. And so, it is an important area of overlapping interest and experience between China and the Southeast Asian countries. There is, of course, a tension inherent in that, is that China is now, a very powerful nation with an imperial potential of its own. And that, that has also courted frictions with Southeast Asian nations at the same time that they do share these common historical experiences.
Thank you. I think that was very clear. So we can see that in the region there have always been two blocks. So we have the United States with its allies on one side and China. What changed throughout the history, and why does China, especially today, appear so determined to make South Asia a province of its empire? Example also, why is it, for example, also with the Islands in the Southeast China Sea? Why does it need the control of that region?
Well, I mean, I don't think that China wants to make it, to have a formal empire in this region.
No, obviously.
Yeah, I do think, though, that, it has a very strong interest in a region that is friendly to it and supportive, in broad terms, of its political and strategic agenda. I think to understand the importance of Southeast Asia, you have to put yourself in the shoes of Chinese leaders. You look out from Beijing, and what do you see? You see, your nation surrounded by potential adversaries. You've got nuclear armed states like Russia and India, which have a history of testy relations with China. You have off the eastern shore of China, you have U.S. treaty allies, South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, and you also have Taiwan, which is obviously fairly close to the United States now as well, if not in a formal sense. And so Southeast Asia is one region where there is not really an incumbent great power. It's a relatively fragmented region. There are some large nations like the Philippines and Indonesia and Vietnam by population are quite significant. But this is a region that is relatively receptive to Chinese influence. The presence of overseas Chinese communities as well means that there are pre-existing commercial and financial connections between mainland China and the capitals and cities of Southeast Asia. So I think the Chinese strategists who view their country as they fear that their country is being encircled and sort of that is tightening in on them. Southeast Asia is one area where they can potentially break free. It's also, it's absolutely crucial in terms of China's trade with the rest of the world. I mean, the South China Sea, the Malacca Strait, through this region courses a huge amount of not only exports of Chinese products to the world, to world markets, but also imports of oil from the Middle East and other goods that are absolutely vital to keeping China's economy running. And so it's only natural that the Chinese leadership wants to, strengthen its control and guarantee its control over this region. It's not going to conquer it outright, but it wants relatively pliant, nations in the region that are not going to ally themselves or, move too close to the United States, and that are going to remain at worst sort of neutral in this current geopolitical standoff.
Thank you. So you talked about India, for example. Nowadays, what other powers are rising that could, I'm not going to say stop China, but be a challenge to China's economic expansion and also political expansion, obviously?
The situation is complex in Southeast Asia. It's not quite a simple binary, division of Southeast Asia into sort of China, the U.S. and its allies, and China. There are overlapping kind of other nations with overlapping interests with regard to China. You have nations like Japan. Obviously India is hugely important. At least its potential is important, although it tends to punch under its weight in Southeast Asia for a variety of reasons. South Korea and Taiwan are both very important economically. The European Union is very important economically as well. And so, there are enough. It's very much a multipolar region. Even Australia plays an important role. And so, all of the nations that I've just mentioned have some degree of concern about China, but each of them tends to view it in slightly different ways. And so their interests align with the United States interests regarding China only so far. And you see that sort of, in some of the, if we look at the, India's position on the war in Ukraine, for instance, we can see that, while India desires very close relationships with the United States, there's a certain distance that it maintains in its foreign policy from signing up to sort of, the full, scope of the U.S. agenda in Southeast Asia and further afield, of course.
Thank you. And so the book was written in 2020, and we saw the evolution of events that have happened to this day. How did they impact the relationship between China and the Asian countries and Southeast Asia in general, especially with COVID, now with the Ukraine conflict?
Well, on COVID, the initial impact of COVID was interesting because if you recall, in the early days, there were a lot of commentators in the United States and I think in Europe also who were talking about how the rest of the world would shun China because it tried to cover up this virus, and then this virus escaped its borders, and we all know the story from there. But there was a certain line of thinking that this would be a huge detriment to China. But as time went by, it became apparent that the nations of Southeast Asia came to rely quite heavily on China for vaccines and other support to fight the virus, in lieu of any sort of support from or any significant support from the UN and Western countries. Western countries did offer fairly significant support, but China's close by. It has massive manufacturing capacity and was able to flood the region with Chinese-made vaccines. Now, one can argue that those vaccines weren't as effective, but they're better than nothing. And a lot of nations, relied quite heavily on that. And so there was also a sense in which I think, and I made this point in my book, and I think it's held up fairly well, although China's zero COVID policy does potentially challenge it if it continues much longer, which is that the COVID pandemic really had the effect of reinforcing the structural underpinnings of China's relationship with Southeast Asia, which is its geographic proximity. The nations of Southeast Asia facing recession due to the pandemic, saw that their economic relationships with China became more valuable than ever before, and they they recognized that China was key to them escaping from these economic slumps. And it still remains the case, even though, tourism, for instance, has been very slow to recover from China because of zero COVID. And so in certain ways, COVID served to reinforce the effect of proximity. And given how important China is to the economies of Southeast Asia, it did not lead to a significant backlash against it. I think privately, a lot of diplomats in Southeast Asia probably would have wanted answers from the Chinese government about what happened. But I think they're also very pragmatic, and they they didn't really play the blame game, and they sort of turned their eyes forward to how they could handle the problem and get their economies going again once the worst impacts of the public health crisis had passed.
Thank you. And what do you see in the future in the relationship between these countries? I know that this question could be just a debate of hours long, but just briefly, what do you think? The relationship between China, that economically and politically will be with these Asian countries going forward?
The relationship between China and Southeast Asia is shot through with a huge amount of anguish and ambivalence. I mean, China's, on the one hand, absolutely crucial to this region's current and future prosperity. But on the other hand, there are, a range of issues and points of tension in the relationships that these various governments have with the Chinese government. And so, I see that as, in the future, as the geopolitical competition with the United States and other nations becomes more acute, this tension in Southeast Asia's relationship with China will increase. And I think that the future will be, much as the past has been. It'll be very, very, a complex, ambiguous relationship between these two regions. A lot of Southeast Asian governments and peoples may not love China, but it's something that that they've been fated by geography to dwell within, close proximity of. And I think that that the two-sided nature of proximity, the sort of the kind of the sense of attraction, economic attraction particularly, coexists with a fear that having such a large and powerful country in your neighborhood is always going to engender. And I think I sort of see the Southeast Asian relationship oscillating between these two extremes. At some moments, you'll see outbursts of anti-Chinese sentiment, but then you'll see pragmatic politicians reaching out to China to help them get their infrastructure going, and et cetera, as we've seen in the Philippines and Indonesia and many other places. So it's going to be complex, and it's going to be ever shifting. But I think that the region will seek to maintain a very careful balance. I don't think we're going to see nations in Southeast Asia signing up to an American coalition aimed at containing China. There's one reason why the Quad does not include any Southeast Asian countries, because I think that they have no interest in a great power conflict, and great power tension makes their lives a lot more difficult. And so they're sort of determined to try and avoid that by sort of maintaining good relationships with both sides. And and this explains, I think, a lot of Southeast Asian nations' caution about the war in Ukraine. They have condemned it in sort of general terms. They haven't gotten very explicit about who is to blame for this war as a massive global, representing a massive global bifurcation. I think a lot of nations are very cautious about picking sides. They might rely on, I won't go too much into that now, but yeah, I think that explains in broad terms why they're sort of sitting on the fence a little bit.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. So I would really like to thank you for this wonderful talk. And I will remind that the book is All'ombra del Dragone di Ad Editori. And I really hope to see you soon in Rome. Maybe next year we can arrange it. And thank you so much for the wonderful insights.